Hello, my name is Rahardja, and I am the program editor for View from Ukraine at the NATO Association of Canada. I'm joined here today by Dr. Kuzio, who is a senior fellow at the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. He is also the author of Ukraine, Democratization, Corruption, and New Russian Imperialism, which was published this summer. Dr. Kuzio, welcome to the NATO Association.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start off by talking a bit about the recent Paris attacks and how they might impact the future of the Ukrainian conflict.
Well, the biggest fear, of course, in a place like Ukraine is similar to the kind of fear that was around back in 2001, that will the big powers do a deal over the heads of the smaller powers? Ukrainians are going to fear that somehow Putin and Western leaders will kind of agree to work together, and then in return for that, in return for Putin's cooperation over Syria, over fighting terrorism, that he would get a blank check for controlling and for intervening in his neighbors and in his so-called sphere of influence. And this was a fear back in 2001 as well, and one of the reasons why Ukraine already in 2002 rushed, as it were, to say, no, we want to join NATO. So, because there was a fear again of the closeness between President Bush and President Putin then. So that is where I think the biggest potential danger is. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think what Putin wants, which is basically another 1945, he wants another Yalta, another a big agreement where the West and the East divide up spheres of influence. I mean, he's living in the past, and I don't believe that the Western European countries and the US and Canada are going to agree to that, particularly because we're going to have a new US president in a year's time, and that person, whether Democrat or Republican, I believe, is going to be far more tougher towards Russia than currently. So I think that there will be attempts by President Putin to sort of use this to his advantage. But there's a lot of skepticism around as well. For example, Russian planes have not been bombing ISIS, they've been bombing the pro-Western opposition in Syria. And so I think there's going to be, yes, we want to work with you, but let's kind of keep our distance.
Mm-hmm. We've heard that the Minsk agreements are not holding right now, which managed a ceasefire. Do you think that Ukrainians should abandon their hope in the international community and start fighting on their own, given that there are these crises that are at hand?
Well, the Ukrainian side has been asking for defensive military equipment from the West for quite a long time. The Western countries, not all of them, have been saying, we don't want to send anything for the time being, because let's see how the Minsk agreements function. And of course, diplomats are very good with words. And so diplomats are playing up how the Minsk agreements are doing a lot of good. The Ukrainian side saying, well, the Russian side is not collaborating on them. So I think that a big game changer is going to be the next US president, because whether Democrat or Republican, they're going to agree with the US Congress and send defensive military equipment to Ukraine. This is going to be a quandary for countries in Western Europe like Germany and for Canada as to what they will do then, because will they continue not to send equipment, or will they follow the American lead? Because once the Americans do this, then the British, the Poles, the East Europeans will probably follow. There are already a large number of countries training Ukrainians. Ukrainians did surprisingly well in halting Russia's incursions and invasions in eastern Ukraine. Putin thought it would be a cakewalk, and it wasn't. He thought that eastern Ukraine would welcome Russia with open arms. That wasn't the case, and in fact many, or I would say the majority of Russian speakers supported the Ukrainian side, not the Russian side. So there's a kind of stalemate at the moment. It's not a frozen conflict as I think many journalists try to describe it, because it's not the same as taken place in Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Their separatist forces, with the help of Russia, defeated central governments. And therefore they created a frozen conflict which was favorable towards the separatists and towards Russia. But in the case of Ukraine, taking aside the Crimea, which is a frozen conflict, but in eastern Ukraine you have an unresolved conflict, and neither side won. Neither side achieved its objectives. And therefore, inevitably, because neither side has achieved its objectives, no peace agreement is going to hold completely, because neither side has got what it wants, as it were. Neither side has defeated the other. And here, what could be a game changer is the supplying of more equipment to Ukraine. The United States is sending some this week. Some radars were sent to the Ukrainian forces by the United States. Ukraine has a large military-industrial complex which has been revived to support its troops and its National Guard. And for the first time, actually, in 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian forces have been quite well built up and quite well trained. There are about 7 countries training Ukrainian forces, including Canada and the US. So the Ukrainian military is in a good position to thwart any further incursions, but the big question is, should they try to retake territory? Should they try to impose their will on what is sovereign Ukrainian land? Most people, I think, most experts, including myself, would believe that Putin only respects strength, doesn't respect weakness.
Moving on to Russia's intervention in Syria, do you think that it will lead to an escalation in the Ukrainian conflict? Or does this indicate the possibility that Putin has sort of relinquished his efforts in Ukraine? I ask because there have been reports that pro-Russian separatists feel abandoned by Moscow given Russia's turn towards Syria.
Right. Well, they feel abandoned because they haven't completed their job. They haven't won. They haven't succeeded in even taking control of the entire Donbass. Russia's separatist proxies control a third of the Donbass. So, in Moldova, Georgia, and in Azerbaijan, those separatist regions were taken control of by those separatist forces completely. In the case of Ukraine, they even failed to do that. And the biggest failure for Putin was his so-called New Russia project, which was to try and unite these Russian-speaking regions in the east and south into one entity, which would be pro-Putin, not pro-Russian, pro-Putin. And that failed as well, because the pro-Russian, if you're a Russian speaker, it does not mean to say you're pro-Putin. And that was his big mistake to think that. And if you watch videos, I've collected a lot of them, on the conflict, you will see that I would say at least 60%, if not more, of the people fighting are Russian speakers on the Ukrainian side. So yes, he didn't achieve what he thought he would very easily achieve, and that's a product of his mindset that wrongly categorizes Ukraine. Back already in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, President Putin said to President Bush, Ukraine's a fake country. It's an artificial country. It's already his view 6 years prior to this crisis. That the whole of the southern region and probably eastern region are just populated by Russians, he said. Now what he meant by Russians was Russian speakers. And what he meant by Russian speakers would be they were pro-Putin. So he got the country completely wrong. And therefore, I think he wanted a kind of a breathing space, and he moved over to Syria. Because he's running a regime that since 2012, when he came back to power, requires this constant mobilization of nationalism, of anti-Western xenophobia. You have to mobilize the masses. You have to sort of keep pumping them with propaganda on TV, and the West is out to get us, the West is out just to put us down, the West is behind Ukraine, trying to take Ukraine away from us. So if it kind of began to fail in Ukraine, or didn't begin to succeed in Ukraine, then you have to look elsewhere. And that's dangerous, of course, because what happens when he finishes in Syria? Where's he going to go next? But I don't think Putin is, and I don't think this is why I don't think the West is going to team up with Putin completely, because what Putin wants in Syria is not what the West wants, and Putin wants to basically do the same as what he did in Chechnya, which is destroy that middle ground. So there's only a choice between Islamic fundamentalists like ISIS and the Assad criminal regime. He doesn't want that middle ground. He didn't want the middle ground amongst Chechens. He wanted to have the Russian state say, we are fighting Wahhabis, backed by Saudi Arabia. And that way he can try to get sympathy from the West for his cause. So can he do both? He thinks maybe he can. Russia is a country of the 4 BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Russia is the only one of the 4 which is a declining power. The other 3 are rising powers who have futures as big powers. Russia is a declining power. That makes it dangerous. And it is a country that has a greater feeling about itself which is not matched by reality. I mean, they have a standing army of 800,000, of whom maybe 50,000 are very well trained professional soldiers who are the so-called little green men. But the rest is a pretty crummy army, and it's spread over a huge number of time zones. So the idea that Russia can do all of these things, which it sees the Americans doing, and sort of thinks they can do it, but it can't. So Russia is it knows that it can't take on NATO. NATO will defeat it very quickly. So, it has modern armies, modern technology, professional soldiers. So it's not going to try to do that. It's going to try to do other things, which is, uses advantage on so-called hybrid war. But the problem with hybrid war is that it requires support on the ground, because you pretend that these are, you send in Russian special forces who work with local supporters. But if there are no local supporters, then you can't do the hybrid war. It's pure invasion. So hybrid war, information technologies where you pump propaganda in, cyber warfare. Russia's got the best cyber warfare capability in the world today. As we've seen, it's hacked into Obama's even email accounts and others. So this is where it wants to work. I mean, in Syria, it can only bomb. I don't think it's going to send troops there, because that would be a second Afghanistan. So it's going to try to pretend that it's a great power that's doing these kind of things, because in Syria it shows that we're back. We're like the Soviet Union now. The Soviet Union was active in Syria and the Middle East. Now Russia's active, but it's going to be very limited, and very limited compared to the West.
So you mentioned NATO previously. As the former director of NATO's Information and Documentation Center in Kyiv, can you speak on what NATO's involvement is in the region and if more should be done on their part?
Well, the NATO relationship with Ukraine has been now active for 21 years. Ukraine was one of the first countries to join the Partnership for Peace program. I believe the first CIS country to join it. And was definitely the most active throughout that 21-year period, except, of course, for when kleptocratic Viktor Yanukovych was in power between 2010 and 2013. But for that entire period, under President Kuchma, who was an East Ukrainian, by the way, and Presidents Yushchenko and President Poroshenko, Ukraine has been very active, both in cooperating with NATO's Partnership for Peace program, and also cooperating with key countries that want to do things on a one-to-one basis, or in a group of countries like the Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian battalion. So Britain in particular has been very active, Canada, US, Poland, probably some Baltic states as well. And that training has continued now. There was always training before, but that training's been stepped up by those 7 countries helping Ukraine and assisting Ukraine. The big areas where NATO was always very, very important were areas of military reform, helping to transform the Ukrainian military. NATO had a problem, of course, with dealing with Ukraine because Ukraine didn't always invest the resources into the military. I mean, that was true of many countries in that region. That's no longer true today. Today, Ukraine spends 5 times more of its GDP on the military than Canada. 5%. Canada spends 1%.
Right.
Of course, a smaller GDP, but as a percentage of GDP, Ukraine's never spent so much on its security as today, and National Guard and military. And there's individual countries like the US has been very active now in transforming the Soviet era Ministry of Interior or the militia into a police force, and that's very important. That's long overdue. So there's both NATO as an organization has been very active and is now, I'm sure, being even more active, and also individual countries. Yeah, I mean, the areas where, NATO is always going to work on the military side, and military reform. That was going to be difficult before because Ukraine wasn't investing very much into its own military, and in some cases, like Yanukovych, they were just not interested in working with NATO. But today, Ukraine, for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine is investing big time into its national security forces, and both in the National Guard as part of the Ministry of Interior and in the Ukraine military. And so that area is going to be important in terms of new structures of the Ukrainian military, reforms. What is especially key here is areas of, and we saw this in the problems of Ukraine's fighting forces during the conflict with Russia, command and control. The way that Western forces operate are very different to the way Ukrainian forces operated under this kind of Soviet officers, where some overweight, very old Soviet-style general sat in Kiev giving orders to people at the front line, and that leading to terrible massacres and lots of casualties. Unlike our type of approach, which is to allow greater operational flexibility in the field, not to have and that increases the autonomy and the importance of middle-level officers who are there with the troops on the ground, as opposed to the guys that sat far away. So all of that kind of thing is inevitably going to be important in changing the manner in which Ukrainian forces operate. But I would say what's key are the other areas. NATO's never really got involved, as far as I understand, in the fields of intelligence service of Ukraine, the security service of Ukraine, and that certainly needs heavily reforming. There was already concern in the late 1990s when I worked at NATO that of Russian penetration, for example, of this kind of thing, of just who are we dealing with, So that, and it's heavily overmanned, like a lot of Ukrainian institutions. Border troops, they need to be completely changed into a kind of a European-style police force, as opposed to a militarized force like in the Soviet Union. And Ukraine has too many of them. They have, if I'm not mistaken, there are more Ukrainian border troops than what the US has, and it has Mexico, a problem with the Mexico border. Ukraine has about 50,000 border troops. It's a huge number. And then the third area would be, of course, working with the National Guard. But that's probably going to be NATO members, particularly in Europe, not really in Britain even, it's some more the European continent, who have structures like Carabinieri in Italy, Civil Guard in Spain, these are these sort of paramilitary structures between the police and the military. In France, CRS and gendarmerie. So those would be the ones helping to transform this National Guard into Ukraine, which was built on the back of something which was called the internal troops of the Ministry of Interior, which is ridiculous. And a democracy cannot have internal troops. Who are you fighting? Your own people. And this is a Soviet legacy. So that's been changed to a National Guard, and that will be modelled on these kind of continental European paramilitary groups. So there's a lot of areas to work on, but now because of what Putin's done, he's forced the Ukrainians to get serious about their national security. He's forced the Ukrainian public to decide where they want to go, whether to the CIS customs union or to NATO. And now is a great opportunity for NATO to get involved.